Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. For this week's project, we have a fairly generous size space for an HO scale railroad. It is one end of the client's basement, and the room set aside for the railroad is approximately 28 feet by 24 feet, although there is an area that can't be used for the railroad. We can see that the stairs come down towards the north, which is to the right side on this plan. There are a few other things under and near the stairs, and the client specified a clear 42-inch walkway around all those obstructions as far as the entrance to the workshop in this other corner. So for the majority of the length of the railroad, we only have a space about 16 feet wide. But as I said, it goes up to 24 feet wide at one end. Fortuitously, it's the last 7 feet that is full width, which allows plenty of space for a turn-back curve in this corner. Now, the client had a lot of steam locomotives, including some larger ones that really needed a 3-foot minimum radius curve to run well. So I started this project, as always, by drawing in some minimum radius circles and seeing what will fit within the space. Here is the first site plan that I drew, assuming that the main line was going to be a folded dog bone around the 3 main walls of the room, with a peninsula occupied by a branch line. Now, the client wanted to have 2 separate routes, a mainline route and a branch line route, and we decided that 30 inches would be sufficient radius for the branch line, as long as we keep that 36 inches on the main. So in addition to the folded dog bone around 3 sides of the room, this first footprint uses the middle of the space with a U-shaped peninsula coming off at the south wall. In this second footprint, it's basically the same design, except that I've flipped the U-shaped peninsula and hooked it up in the southeast corner of the room. Here I've tried to flip the plan as far as the long and short walls are concerned, so the peninsula still hooks up in the same place, but folds back on itself in the opposite direction. And I was trying to see if this would give us more space, and in fact it doesn't. We end up with a central peninsula that is really too convoluted to be worthwhile. Although on the plus side, we do get space for a mini peninsula on the north side of the room, which is a great location for an industrial area that can be viewed from both sides. This is the equivalent footprint as the previous one, but with the central peninsula flipped left to right and hooked up from the north end of the room. And here is that same design with the peninsula coming off the long west wall. And at this point I concluded that none of the footprints folding the central peninsula in this direction were optimal. So I started looking at alternative designs. Here what I've done is extended the folded dog bone around the last side of the railroad space and put the turn-back curve in the middle of the room. It's possible to continue the peninsula around for one more length of the room, although at this point we are limited to the branch line radius curve, and we do end up with some narrow aisles. Here is a slight variation on that space. What I've done here is moved the storage cabinet that was beside the stairs and put it by the entrance to the workshop. That gives us a little more width in this area and allows this branch line curve at the end of the peninsula to fit within 2 full 3-foot wide aisles. So I sent this version off to the client asking if this arrangement for the storage units would be acceptable. The client didn't like the L-shape arrangement, but said that we could turn the larger unit around 90 degrees and put it in this location, and then move the smaller unit the other side to where the dashed line is, and if we angle it slightly, we still get the exact same footprint available for the railroad. So having determined that this is the best overall footprint for the railroad, it's now time to start allocating the space. Now, the client specification was for a main line with a large yard as big as I could get, and a second smaller yard at the end of the branch line. Now, the first couple of iterations I drew had the main yard along the long west wall, but it didn't really work very well because the benchwork here is a little narrower than optimal, and we couldn't get a big enough engine terminal adjacent to it. So I proposed the idea of wrapping the main yard around the end of the room, and here everything fitted a lot better because the engine terminal can be in this 7-foot wide area in the corner. Now, the schematic is the one that lasted right up until the final design. We have a single track main loop with 3-foot minimum curves. It's on the outer of these two curves in this corner, through the main yard, and then follows the front edge of the benchwork around as far as this point where it disappears from view, continuing downgrade to a staging yard under the main level, and then rising back up again on a helix in this corner. Now the branch line junction is just at the end of the main yard, and we continue all the way around the entire railroad using both lobes of the peninsula and ending up at a small yard beside the stairs. And you may notice that it's not a terminal yard. I've added a hidden branch line connection from this small yard around 3 sides of the room through a staging area and back to the other end of the main yard. Now this gave the client the 2 continuous loops that he wanted. Initially he was hoping for a double track main line, but it would have resulted in the railroad being too cluttered and also wasting length for crossovers at both ends of the rather shorter than optimal yard area. Here is the lower level with, as I mentioned, the main line continuing to a staging yard along the long wall. At this point we also talked about making better use of the lower level of the railroad. So here is a variation that I drew. Adding a single lap helix at this point in the middle of the room allows us to get enough vertical clearance to put a second scenic level under the small branch line yard, and then wrapping the staging yard around this one corner instead of running the whole length of the rear wall allows a second scenic area under this area. And for convenience of discussion I called them Shadow Box A and Shadow Box B. Anyway, he kicked this idea around for a while and eventually decided he didn't really want to go with a full double deck layout. He preferred the previous version with the lower level being staging only. At this point we decided that the basic layout design was good to go and that it was time to start filling in details. Here is a version with most of the track filled in on the main level. I've worked out how best to get the ladder in on the main yard and figured out where the industrial spurs will fit. Additionally, I've also given some consideration to elevations. You can see these on this version of the drawing. Here is the lower level, and the client had asked if it was possible to put the staging yard in the corner of the room under the main yard, allowing more space at the other end for a longer grade down to get more clearance between the two. And now that we have a longer grade down to staging, we added 1 extra lap of the helix and we got a good vertical separation. It also clears up the north end of the upper deck for additional staging area. I've drawn in 8 stub auxiliary staging tracks and added a locomotive storage area in this corner. Here we are back on the upper level, and I've drawn in some of the scenery in order to illustrate how I planned on controlling viewing lines and getting the most interesting views in each scene. This is a little more challenging than my normal designs because most scenes have both routes running through them, whereas most of my layout designs strive to have only one main line running through most scenes. Note that in the small town on the main line, although we have a long passing siding which is partially hidden, we do have a crossover right here allowing for a short run round and allowing the industries at this point to be switched without having to make long run round moves to the far end of the passing siding on the other scene. And note how there is a few feet of level track at this point to make switching a lot easier. Here I developed it a little bit further. This is a slight enlargement cropping off the bottom of the railroad, allowing the client to see more details. Now this is not the very next version that I drew. I've skipped through quite a lot of iterations on this video. Up until now I'd shown 2 spurs in this area serving a mine, but the client said he had a large sawmill complex that he wanted to use this area for. And this small town in the middle of the layout was the last one I filled in, and I asked the client if he wanted me to develop this area with some more industrial spurs, and he said absolutely yes. So I've suggested an interchange curving off into the trees. It can be a fairly long spur, a short spur to an industry in this corner, and the mine returned more or less in the same orientation, but the other side of the stream. At this point I still have not started tackling the branch yard area. Here is the next iteration of the drawing, once again showing the full layout. The mine has now been replaced again with a stone block loading area, serving a quarry which is just going to be printed on the backdrop. We're not actually going to model the quarry in 3D at all. The other thing that has changed quite significantly in this drawing is the main yard area. We did a complete revamp of the industrial spurs. The client asked if he could have an icing dock and some stock pens. And by modifying the industrial spurs in this area, I found room for both. And in the correspondence that we had about this version, I suggested replacing all the small industries in this area with a large meat packing plant being served by several spurs. And if we did that, both the icing dock and the stock pens would now become part of that packing plant. Another change at this point was that the client pointed out he had a very large variety of cabooses which he would like to keep on display. So instead of having a single caboose track, we've now got a 3-track caboose yard. Now it's a little bit cramped, and I mentioned to the client he could easily reduce it to 2 tracks with a lot more space around them just by omitting this one turnout. In order to make space for the additional caboose storage space, the rip track has now been moved to the other end of the railroad near the engine terminal. And actually that's possibly a better place for it anyway. Anyway, at this point, the client is very happy with the bulk of the railroad. The only area I still haven't yet tackled is Mansfield Yard on the branch line. So that will be next. I went through a few versions of this design, and this is what I eventually came up with. I've got a 5-track yard with 3 through tracks and 2 stub tracks. I've got a small engine terminal in the front. Although it's a lot smaller than the other one, it does still have all the facilities necessary. And I've got another rip track here as well, because those are always fun to include. There's also a couple of industrial spurs, a team track and a freight house. And the idea behind this yard is that it is an interchange with another railroad that makes an end-on connection, thus justifying the engine terminal because all the road power will terminate here and head back to the main yard. As I mentioned earlier, the client has a large fleet of steam locomotives which he wanted to keep on display on the visible portion of the railroad. Anyway, the client really liked this version of the Mansfield Yard. I think his words were, "Wow, it's a huge transformation," something along those lines. And with that done, all that remains is to fill in the remainder of the scenery suggestions. So here is the final version of the railroad, or at least the upper deck of it, with all the scenery filled in. And I've also removed all the annotations from this view. Please feel free to pause it at this point if you want a longer look. Here is the staging level, once again with all the annotations removed. Once again, feel free to pause it if you want to. Anyway, that is about all I really have to say about this design. I've tried to keep it a little bit shorter than my usual layout design videos. Before signing off, I will just go back to the main level again and leave this slide up. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I found it useful or interesting or both, and I hope to see you back next time. So until then, thanks for watching and bye for now.